At 91, Shirley MacLaine finally opens up about Paul Newman. Shirley MacLaine was born Shirley MacLaine Beatty on April 24, 1934, in Richmond, Virginia. She emerged from a creative Southern household to become one of Hollywood's most enduring and unconventional stars. Her early years were steeped in artistic expression and intellectual curiosity. She was the daughter of Kathleen Corinne, a drama teacher, and Ira Owens Beatty, a psychology professor and real estate agent. Growing up in Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from the nation's capital, Shirley was exposed to both the performing arts and academic rigor from an early age. Her mother's passion for theater and her father's analytical mind created a unique environment that encouraged both creativity and critical thinking. Shirley was the older sister of Warren Beatty, who would himself become one of Hollywood's most celebrated actors and directors, though their paths would take distinctly different trajectories through the entertainment landscape. From childhood, Shirley showed an extraordinary talent for dance. She began ballet lessons at the age of 3, and by her teenage years, she was training seriously with dreams of becoming a professional ballerina. Her dedication was intense. She would practice for hours, perfecting her technique and building the discipline that would later serve her well in the demanding world of film and theater. However, her body eventually told her what her mind didn't want to hear. She lacked the ideal physical proportions for classical ballet. At 5 feet 7 inches, she was considered too tall for most ballet companies of the era, and her ankles, though strong, weren't quite suited for the rigorous demands of point work at the professional level. Rather than viewing this as a defeat, Shirley pivoted with characteristic determination. If she couldn't be a ballerina, she would find another way to perform. She shifted her focus toward Broadway, where her dance training, stage presence, and natural charisma could shine in musical theater. In the early 1950s, Shirley made her way to New York City, joining the chorus of several Broadway productions. She worked tirelessly, taking any role she could get, learning the craft of performance from the ground up. Her big break came in one of those magical show business moments that seems almost scripted. In 1954, she was understudying the lead role of a dancer in the Broadway production of The Pajama Game. When the star, Carol Haney, injured her ankle, Shirley stepped into the role with virtually no rehearsal. That night, Hal Wallace happened to be in the audience, scouting for new talent. He was immediately struck by Shirley's energy, timing, and distinctive presence. Within weeks, she had signed a contract with Paramount Pictures, and her life changed forever. Her film debut came in Alfred Hitchcock's dark comedy, The Trouble with Harry, in 1955. Hitchcock saw something special in Shirley, a combination of wholesome American beauty and sharp intelligence, mixed with an offbeat sensibility that set her apart from the typical Hollywood ingenue. Her performance was well received, and she quickly followed it with roles in Artists and Models, opposite Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, and Around the World in 80 Days, the epic adventure film that won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1956. Throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Shirley MacLaine established herself as one of Hollywood's most versatile and compelling actresses. She possessed a rare ability to move seamlessly between comedy and drama, bringing depth to lighthearted roles and unexpected humor to serious ones. Her performances were marked by an emotional honesty that resonated with audiences. She never played characters as merely sweet or merely tough. Instead, she found the complicated humanity in everyone she portrayed. Some of her most memorable performances during this golden period included Some Came Running in 1958, directed by Minnelli, where she played a vulnerable good-time girl opposite Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. Her performance earned her the first of many Academy Award nominations. She followed this with The Apartment in 1960, directed by Billy Wilder, where she played Fran Kubelik, an elevator operator caught in a complicated romantic situation with Jack Lemmon's character. The film was both a critical and commercial triumph, winning the Academy Award for Best Picture, and Shirley's performance is still considered one of her finest, capturing both the sweetness and the world weariness of a woman navigating the complicated power dynamics of corporate America. She continued to take on challenging and diverse roles throughout the decade, starring in Irma la Douce in 1963, reuniting with Billy Wilder and Jack Lemmon in a comedy about a Parisian prostitute that showcased her physical comedy skills and her ability to bring dignity to unconventional characters. Her work in The Children's Hour in 1961, directed by William Wyler, tackled the then taboo subject of lesbianism and showed her willingness to take on socially challenging material. She also appeared in Two for the Seesaw opposite Robert Mitchum, What a Way to Go with Paul Newman, and Gambit with Michael Caine, each role adding another dimension to her growing reputation as an actress who could do anything. Beyond her work in film, Shirley became known for her outspoken personality and her refusal to conform to Hollywood's expectations of how a female star should behave. She was politically active, particularly in her opposition to the Vietnam War, and she wasn't afraid to speak her mind about social issues, feminism, and the treatment of women in the entertainment industry. She also developed a deep interest in spirituality and metaphysics, which would become a defining aspect of her public persona in later decades. The 1970s brought continued success and evolution for Shirley MacLaine. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her role in Terms of Endearment in 1983, playing Aurora Greenway, a complex, difficult, deeply loving mother in a story about the relationship between a mother and daughter over 30 days. Her acceptance speech, in which she joked about deserving the award and then became genuinely emotional, was vintage Shirley. Candid, funny, and ultimately deeply human. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, she remained active and relevant, starring in films like Madame Sosatska, Steel Magnolias, Postcards from the Edge, and Guarding Tess. She also wrote a series of best-selling memoirs that explored her spiritual beliefs, her experiences with reincarnation and past lives, her travels, and her reflections on the entertainment industry. These books, including Out on a Limb and Dancing in the Light, made her a figure of both admiration and gentle mockery. But Shirley never seemed to care what people thought. She lived her truth, and that authenticity only deepened her connection with her fans. Shirley MacLaine's personal life was as colorful and unconventional as her career. In 1954, just as her film career was beginning, she married Steve Parker, a businessman and aspiring producer. Their marriage was unusual from the start. Parker spent much of his time in Japan, where he had business interests, while Shirley remained primarily in the United States, pursuing her acting career. For most of their marriage, they lived on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean, seeing each other only sporadically. This arrangement suited Shirley in many ways. She valued her independence and her freedom to focus on her work without the daily constraints of a traditional marriage. She was open about the fact that both she and Parker had relationships with other people during their marriage, though they maintained a connection that lasted for decades. In 1956, they had a daughter, Sachi Parker, who was raised primarily by her father in Japan. Sachi's relationship with her mother would become complicated and painful. In later years, Sachi wrote a memoir that portrayed Shirley as a distant and often absent mother, more focused on her career and her spiritual pursuits than on parenting. Shirley's response to these criticisms was characteristically blunt and unapologetic. She acknowledged that she had not been a conventional mother, but she stood by her choices, arguing that she had been honest with her daughter about her priorities and that she had provided for her materially and emotionally in the ways she knew how. Shirley and Steve Parker's marriage officially ended in divorce in 1982, though they had been living separate lives for many years. Despite the unconventional nature of their relationship, Shirley spoke of Parker with respect in later interviews, acknowledging that they had shared an understanding that worked for them, even if it seemed strange to others. Throughout her life, Shirley had numerous romantic relationships, some brief and some lasting, but she never remarried. She valued her autonomy too much to commit to another traditional marriage. Among her rumored relationships were affairs with some of Hollywood's most prominent leading men, as well as politicians and intellectuals she met through her political activism and her travels around the world. She was particularly close to members of the Rat Pack, especially Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, with whom she worked on several films. Her friendship with these men was built on mutual respect, shared humor, and a love of performing. She could hold her own in their world of hard drinking, late-night carousing, and sharp wit, but she also maintained boundaries and never allowed herself to be diminished or objectified by the masculine culture of that era's Hollywood. Her interest in spirituality deepened significantly in the 1970s. She traveled extensively, studying with spiritual teachers in Peru, India, and other parts of the world. She explored meditation, channeling, energy healing, and past life regression, and she became a vocal proponent of New Age philosophy. Her books on these subjects introduced millions of readers to ideas about... She paused, gathering her thoughts, and then continued with the characteristic directness that had marked her entire career. I first met Paul in the late 1950s. We were both at Paramount, both young and ambitious, both trying to figure out how to have careers that meant something beyond just being pretty faces on screen. He was already getting attention for his looks, those blue eyes, that smile, but what struck me immediately was his seriousness. He wanted to be a real actor, not just a movie star, and he was willing to work for it. Shirley recalled their early conversations about craft, about the differences between stage and screen acting, about the difficulty of maintaining integrity in an industry that often valued commerce over art. Paul came from the method school, that whole Lee Strasberg actors studio tradition. He took it very seriously. I was more intuitive in my approach, more willing to trust my instincts and just go with what felt right in the moment. We used to have these long debates about technique, about whether you should fully inhabit a character's emotional life or maintain some distance and control. We never quite agreed, but I think we both learned from each other. Their first professional collaboration came in 1963, when they starred together in What a Way to Go, a comedy in which Shirley played a woman whose husbands keep dying and leaving her enormous fortunes, while Paul played one of those ill-fated husbands. It was a stylish, satirical film that showcased both actors' abilities to handle comedy with sophistication. Working with Paul on that film was a revelation, Shirley remembered. He was so committed, even in a comedy, even in a role that was essentially a supporting part. He never phoned it in. Never. There was this moment we had to shoot where his character, this avant-garde artist, has this elaborate death scene, and Paul played it with such commitment and such precision that everyone on set just stopped and watched. That was Paul. Total dedication, whether it was comedy or drama, whether he was the lead or not. She smiled as she continued, and he was funny, really funny. Off camera, he had this dry wit, this way of observing the absurdities of Hollywood and just skewering them with a single comment. We spent a lot of time between takes just talking, laughing. He told me once that he thought acting was kind of ridiculous when you really thought about it. Grown people pretending to be other people, all these technicians and lights and cameras just to capture something that would flicker on a screen for a few minutes. But then, he said, but when it works, when it really works, it's the closest thing to magic I know. And I agreed with him completely. As Shirley spoke, she addressed something that had always fascinated her about Newman, his marriage to Joanne Woodward. Paul and Joanne were the real thing, she said emphatically. In a town where marriages lasted about as long as a press junket, they were together for more than 50 years. And it wasn't some perfect fairy tale. They had their struggles, their difficult periods, times when they had to work at it. But they were committed to each other in a way that was almost radical for Hollywood. She leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. I envied that sometimes, not because I wanted to be Joanne or wanted Paul for myself, but because they had something I never quite managed to find, or maybe never quite wanted to commit to, that deep, lasting partnership. I chose independence. I chose my work. I chose to keep my options open, to explore, to wander. Paul chose Joanne, and he never wavered from that choice, at least not in any way that mattered. There's something beautiful about that kind of devotion. Shirley was candid about the attraction she felt toward Newman, an attraction she shared with much of the female population of the planet during his heyday. "Of course I found him attractive," she said with a laugh. "I'd have to been dead not to. Those eyes alone could stop traffic." But more than his looks, it was his presence. Paul had this quality of being fully present with you when you were talking to him. He listened. He thought about what you said. He didn't just wait for his turn to talk. In Hollywood, where everyone is always performing, always on, that kind of genuine attention is incredibly attractive. She recalled an evening in the late 1960s when she, Newman, and several other actors gathered at a dinner party at the home of Sidney Poitier. This was during the height of the civil rights movement, and we were all very involved in various ways, marching, fundraising, using our platforms to speak out. Paul was particularly committed. He was one of the few major stars who put his career on the line for his political beliefs. That night, we talked for hours about the state of the country, about the war in Vietnam, about what our responsibilities were as artists and as citizens. Shirley paused, her expression becoming more serious. Paul said something that night that stayed with me. He said, "If we're just entertainers, if we're just selling a product, then what's the point? We have to stand for something, or we're just part of the machinery that keeps everything the same." And he meant it. He put his money where his mouth was over and over again. He supported causes that weren't popular, candidates who were considered too progressive, organizations that were fighting for real change. And he did it quietly, without making a big show of it, because that wasn't his style. The conversation turned to Newman's work as a director and his commitment to nurturing new talent. After Paul started directing, after films like Rachel and The Glass Menagerie, he became even more interesting to me. He wasn't content just to be in front of the camera. He wanted to tell stories, to shape narratives, to give opportunities to actors who weren't getting them. He directed Joanne in Rachel, and her performance in that film is extraordinary. He saw her talent, her depth, and he created a space for her to show it. That's love, but it's also respect. He respected her as an artist, not just as his wife. That he could just be a regular person walking down the street, going to the hardware store, sitting in a coffee shop without people staring. I told him that was the price of the ticket, that we'd all signed up for this when we decided we wanted to be actors. But I understood his frustration. Fame is a strange thing. It gives you so much, but it takes away your anonymity, your privacy, your ability to just exist in the world without being observed. Shirley addressed Newman's competitive nature, particularly on the racetrack and in his career. Paul was intensely competitive, she said. He wanted to win, whether it was a race, an acting award, or just a friendly game of pool. But his competitiveness wasn't mean-spirited. He competed with himself more than with others. He was always trying to be better, to push himself further. I think that drive is what kept him working and improving well into his 80s. He never got complacent. He never thought he'd figured it all out. He stayed hungry, stayed curious, and that kept him vital. She recalled a conversation they had about acting technique in the 1970s, during the height of both their careers. We were at some industry event, and we ended up in a corner talking for hours about the craft, Shirley remembered. Paul was telling me about his process, how he built characters from the inside out, how he tried to find the emotional truth in every moment. I told him I worked more from instinct, from a kind of spiritual connection to the character. He was fascinated by that. He asked me all these questions about how I prepared, what I did to get into the right headspace. We were approaching the same goal from completely different angles, but we both respected each other's methods. She paused, then added, That conversation meant a lot to me because Paul took my approach seriously. A lot of method actors looked down on more intuitive approaches, dismissed them as not rigorous enough. But Paul understood that there were many paths to truth in acting, and he was genuinely interested in learning about different techniques. That intellectual openness, that lack of dogmatism, that was one of his best qualities. Shirley spoke about Newman's relationship with money and success. Paul came from a middle-class background in Ohio. His family owned a sporting goods store. He wasn't poor, but he wasn't wealthy either. I think that background kept him grounded. Even when he became enormously successful and rich, he never flaunted it. He lived well, but not ostentatiously. He drove practical cars when he wasn't racing. He and Joanne lived in the same house in Connecticut for decades. They didn't collect mansions or yachts or any of the usual trappings of Hollywood wealth. And then with Newman's Own, he gave it all away. Every cent of profit went to charity. That's extraordinary when you think about it. Most wealthy people, even those who are generous, keep most of their money and donate a portion. Paul inverted that. He kept what he needed to live comfortably and gave away the rest. That kind of generosity isn't just about money, it's about values, about what he thought is important in life. When asked about Newman's views on religion and spirituality, Shirley became thoughtful. Paul was raised Jewish, though his family wasn't particularly religious. He described himself as a secular Jew, someone who identified with the cultural tradition but didn't practice the faith. He was skeptical of organized religion, but I think he had a deep ethical sense, a strong moral compass that came from somewhere spiritual, even if he wouldn't have used that word. She smiled. We had some interesting conversations about spirituality over the years. I'm very open about my beliefs in reincarnation, in past lives, in a spiritual reality beyond the material world. Paul was polite about it, but I could tell he thought I was a little crazy. He'd listen to me talk about astral projection or channeling, and he'd get this amused look on his face, like he was indulging a well-meaning but delusional friend. But he never dismissed me or mocked me. He just had a different worldview, more rationalist, more grounded in the here and now. Shirley reflected on what Newman taught her about aging. Watching Paul age was instructive for me. He didn't rage against getting older. He didn't try to pretend he was still 30. He accepted the physical changes, the slowing down, the limits that come with age. But he didn't give up either. He kept working when roles interested him. He kept racing until he was well into his 70s. He stayed engaged with the world, with politics, with the things he cared about. He showed me that you could grow old with dignity and grace, that aging didn't mean becoming irrelevant or invisible. She added, of course, he had the advantage of being a man. In Hollywood, men are allowed to age. They're called distinguished. They're given roles as wise elders or experienced leaders. Women are just called old. We're discarded, pushed aside for younger actresses. I fought against that my whole career, and I'm still fighting it at 91. But Paul's example showed me that if you insisted on your own value, if you refused to be marginalized, you could continue working and contributing as you aged. Shirley talked about Newman's famous practical jokes and his sense of humor. Paul loved practical jokes, she said with a laugh. He had this running prank war with Robert Redford that went on for years. They'd send each other increasingly absurd gifts. A wrecked car, a broken slot machine, all kinds of ridiculous things. It was this way of showing affection, of maintaining connection. Very male, very silly, but also kind of sweet. She recalled a prank Newman pulled on me during a dinner party. We were at someone's house for dinner, maybe 20 people, and Paul somehow arranged for the entire meal to be blue. Blue soup, blue bread, blue salad, blue wine, everything was dyed blue. It looked absolutely disgusting, but it was edible. Everyone was horrified at first, and then we realized it was Paul's doing, and we all burst out laughing. That was his sense of humor, absurdist, a little dark, but never mean. He never pranked people in ways that humiliated them or made them uncomfortable. It was always playful, always in good fun. Shirley explained Newman's relationship with the press. Paul hated the Hollywood press. He thought it was intrusive and superficial. He'd do the minimum required to promote his films, but he never courted publicity, never played the Hollywood game of leaking stories or staging photo ops. He especially protected his family, his children, from media attention. After what happened with Scott, I think he became even more protective, even more determined to keep his private life private. She continued, I respected that about him. Even though my relationship with the press was different, I was more open, more willing to share aspects of my life, particularly my spiritual journey. But Paul set boundaries and enforced them. He didn't owe the public access to every aspect of his life, and he refused to give it. In today's world with social media and 24-hour celebrity coverage, I'm not sure an actor could maintain the privacy Paul did, but he managed it through sheer force of will and consistency. Shirley reflected on Newman's body of work and which performances she found most memorable. There are so many great Newman performances, she mused. Fast Eddie Felson in The Hustler, and then again in The Color of Money 25 years later. Watching that character age and change over time was remarkable. Luke Jackson in Cool Hand Luke, the stubborn rebel who refuses to be broken. Butch Cassidy, charming and doomed. Frank Galvin in The Verdict, a washed-up lawyer fighting for redemption. And Sully in Nobody's Fool, this aging small-town handyman full of regrets, but still hanging on to his dignity. She paused, thinking. But you know what performance of Paul's I find most affecting? His role in the effect of gamma rays on Man in the Moon marigolds, which he also directed. He played a very small part, just a few minutes of screen time, as a junk dealer. But there was such sadness and weariness in that performance, such lived-in reality. It showed that Paul could disappear into a character, even a tiny supporting role, and bring complete authenticity to it. That's great acting. Not needing to be the star, not needing to dominate every scene, just serving the story and the truth of the moment. Shirley asked if Paul had any major career regrets. Paul turned down some iconic roles over the years. He passed on The Graduate, which went to Dustin Hoffman. He turned down Kramer vs. Kramer, which won an Oscar for Dustin Hoffman. He said no to several other films that became huge hits. But I never heard him express real regret about those decisions. He believed in trusting his instincts in the moment, and if a role didn't feel right to him, he passed. Sometimes that meant missing out on something great, but it also meant he never did work that felt false or compromised. The only thing I ever heard Paul express regret about was his relationship with his son Scott. He wished he'd been more present, more understanding, more able to help Scott with his struggles. That haunted him. But in terms of his career, his work, no, I don't think he had major regrets. He'd done what he wanted to do, told the stories he wanted to tell, worked with people he respected. That's more than most actors can say. Shirley spoke about Newman's sense of style and how he carried himself. Paul had this effortless style. He looked good in everything, a tuxedo, jeans and a t-shirt, racing overalls. But it wasn't studied or affected. He just wore what was comfortable and appropriate. And because he was...
Shirley spoke about Newman's approach to script selection. Paul was famously picky about scripts, especially later in his career, she said. He'd turned down 10 projects for every one he accepted. He was looking for characters that interested him, stories that had something to say, directors he respected. Money wasn't the primary consideration. He'd do small indie films if the material was good. That selectivity meant his filmography is remarkably strong. Very few real duds, lots of interesting work. That's the benefit of being able to say no, of having the power and the financial security to wait for the right project. She reflected on whether Newman ever felt he'd done enough. I don't think Paul ever felt like he'd done enough, Shirley mused. There were always more children who needed help, more causes to support, more stories to tell, more races to run. He wasn't someone who could rest on his laurels. Even in his 80s, when most people would have retired, he was still working, still involved with his foundation, still showing up. That drive, that inability to be satisfied, it's what kept him vital. But I also think it was exhausting. Sometimes I wished he could just relax, just enjoy what he'd accomplished, but that wasn't in his nature. When asked about Newman's sense of humor and what made him laugh, Shirley smiled broadly. Paul had a wry, dry sense of humor, she said. He appreciated absurdity, irony, the ridiculous aspects of life. He wasn't into slapstick or obvious jokes. His humor was more observational, more subtle. He'd make these deadpan comments that would take you a second to get, and then you'd burst out laughing. He especially loved puncturing Hollywood pomposity, making fun of the self-importance that infected so much of the industry. She recalled a specific moment. We were at some award show in the 1980s, and there was this incredibly pretentious speech being given about the importance of cinema as art. Paul leaned over and whispered, "We're just people pretending for money. Let's not overthink it." That was classic Paul, cutting through the bullshit, keeping things in perspective, refusing to take it all too seriously. Shirley addressed the physicality of Newman's performances. Paul was a very physical actor, she observed. Whether he was playing pool in The Hustler, boxing in Somebody Up There Likes Me, or doing his own driving stunts in various films, he committed physically. He understood that how a body moves tells you about a character, their confidence, their history, their state of mind. He trained for roles, learned skills, put himself through physical challenges. That dedication to the physical reality of a character is something I always admired. She spoke about Newman's relationship with directors and how he collaborated. Paul worked with some of the greatest directors in cinema history: Martin Ritt, Robert Altman, George Roy Hill, Sidney Lumet, Sam Mendes. And he was known as a dream to work with, prepared, professional, open to direction, but also willing to offer suggestions. He had a collaborative spirit. He didn't try to take over or impose his will. He trusted directors he respected and gave him his best work. But he wasn't a pushover. If something didn't feel right, he'd speak up. He'd advocate for the character, for the truth of a scene. That balance between humility and confidence, that's what made him such a great collaborator. Shirley reflected on what she would want Paul to know about his impact on her personally. If I could tell Paul how he affected my life, I'd say this: you made me believe that integrity was possible in Hollywood, that you didn't have to compromise your values to succeed. You showed me that kindness and strength weren't mutually exclusive, that you could be tough and tender at the same time. You demonstrated that aging didn't mean diminishing, that you could grow more interesting, more valuable, more yourself as the years passed. And you gave me the gift of your friendship, your honesty, your presence. Those lessons, those gifts, they shaped me, they sustained me, they made me better. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for everything. She paused, her eyes glistening slightly. And I tell him that I loved him. Not romantically, but truly and deeply. He was one of the great souls I've known in this life, and knowing him made my life richer and more meaningful. Shirley spoke about the contrast between Paul's public image and his private self. The public saw Paul Newman, movie star, gorgeous, cool, unflappable. The private Paul was more complicated. He could be insecure, moody, self-critical. He struggled with depression at times, especially after losing Scott. He had a temper, though he kept it under control. He could be stubborn and inflexible about things he cared about. He was fully human, with all the contradictions and difficulties that implies. But his best qualities, his decency, his generosity, his commitment to his values, those were real too. The private man matched the public image in the ways that mattered most. She addressed what it was like to watch Newman's health decline in his final years. I didn't see Paul much in his last few years, Shirley admitted. He was dealing with cancer, pulling back from public life, focusing on his family. I respected his privacy and his need to face his mortality on his own terms. But it was hard to know he was suffering. This vital, energetic man, this person who'd been so alive, it's painful to imagine that being diminished by illness. But from what I heard, he faced it with the same courage he'd faced everything else. No self-pity, no drama, just quiet acceptance and grace. Shirley reflected on Joanne Woodward's life after Paul's death. "Joanne has Alzheimer's now," she said sadly. "She's lost so much of herself, including probably most of her memories of Paul, of their life together. That's such a cruel irony, to survive the person you loved for 50 years, and then to lose even the memories of them." Paul would have been heartbroken to see her this way. But her daughters are caring for her beautifully, and she's surrounded by love. That's something. She spoke about the way Newman approached playing older characters. "Paul didn't try to hide his age or play younger than he was," Shirley observed. "When he was in his 60s and 70s, he played characters in their 60s and 70s. He let his face show the years, let his body move with the stiffness and caution of age. There's this moment in Nobody's Fool where Sully bends down to pick something up, and you see how much effort it takes, how his back hurts. Paul didn't glamorize aging or sentimentalize it. He showed it honestly, the pain, the limitations, but also the wisdom and the endurance. That honesty about aging was radical, especially for a leading man." Shirley addressed the question of whether Newman ever had any serious religious or spiritual awakening late in life. "Not that I know of. Paul remained pretty secular to the end, as far as I'm aware. He didn't turn to religion when he got sick or when he knew he was dying. His ethics came from a humanistic place, not from a theological one. He believed in being good to people because it was the right thing to do, not because of divine reward or punishment. I found that admirable, even though my own path has been different. You don't need God to be good. Paul proved that." She spoke about specific scenes in Newman's films that she found particularly powerful. There's a scene in The Verdict where Paul's character, Frank Galvin, is sitting in a hospital room with a comatose woman who's at the center of his case. He's taking Polaroids of her as evidence, and as he does, he just starts sobbing. It's this breakdown, this moment where all his cynicism and all his pain just pouring out. Paul played it so raw, so unguarded. You felt this man's brokenness, his desperate need for redemption. That scene still haunts me decades later. And she continued, "And there's a moment in Cool Hand Luke where Luke is in the box, solitary confinement, and he's been broken by the system, and he comes out and he's different, diminished. Paul showed that transformation without words, just through his eyes, his posture, the way he held his body. You saw the light go out in Luke, and it was devastating. That's the kind of acting that transcends technique. That's pure truth." Shirley reflected on Newman's relationship with money and wealth. Paul made a fortune from his acting career and then another fortune from Newman's own. But wealth never defined him or changed who he was fundamentally. He lived comfortably but not extravagantly. He gave away most of what he made. He didn't collect art or cars. Well, he had race cars, but those were tools for his sport, not status symbols. Money was a means to an end for Paul. Security for his family, resources for his causes, fuel for his passions. But it wasn't the goal. That's increasingly rare, especially in contemporary Hollywood where wealth accumulation seems to be the whole point for many people. She spoke about what Newman represented in terms of American masculinity. Paul Newman represented a particular kind of American masculinity that's maybe disappearing, Shirley observed. He was tough but not violent, strong but not domineering, confident but not arrogant. He could be vulnerable without being weak, gentle without being soft. He took care of people, stood up for what was right, worked hard, stayed loyal. That's a model of masculinity that feels almost old-fashioned now, but it's one we could use more of. Not the toxic masculinity of aggression and dominance, but the healthy masculinity of strength in service of others. Shirley addressed Newman's work ethic and his professionalism. Paul showed up prepared, knew his lines, hit his marks, and gave directors what they needed. That sounds basic, but you'd be surprised how many actors don't manage even that. He respected the crew, the other actors, everyone on set. He understood that filmmaking is a collaborative art and that everyone's contribution matters. That professionalism, that respect for the craft and the people you work with, it created an atmosphere where good work could happen. Sets where Paul was the lead were known as happy sets, places where people wanted to work. She reflected on a letter Newman once sent her.